Hello, everyone. My name is Manasi Kumar, and I am an associate professor at OP Jindal Global University. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Yogendra Kumar, a former diplomat of the Government of India. He is also my father. He is the author of a new book, Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, Mapping an Alternative Global Future. I hope everyone can see that right now. I'm showing it on the screen. So as this format actually requires the author to elaborate on the thematic structure of this latest book of his, I will pose some basic questions to enable him to do that within the 20 minutes of the allotted time. So Mr. Kumar, could you please explain to your audience what inspired you to write this book?
First of all, I'm grateful to the organizers of the prestigious literary festival to provide me with this opportunity. Perhaps a certain timeliness about this book is noteworthy, as we have all just celebrated the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. The book Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, Mapping an Alternative Global Future, has been published by Routledge. It explores the paradox dating back to the end of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union in 1991. A starting point in this exploration is to understand the intractable nature of our current global challenges. The end of the Cold War, of the US-USSR confrontation, bred the expectation of the world becoming a better place and at peace with itself. The initial steps of the leaders of the US and USSR, and later Russia, led to significant nuclear weapons control agreements, agreement on conventional arms control in Eurasia, creation of newer forms of Eurasian Institution for Peace and Economic Development, shared assumption about the process for their realization, and the nature of political and economic transformation among Central and Eastern European countries and the former Soviet republics, as well as the settlement of various Cold War-rooted international hotspots. Yet, as it turned out, a certain chain of events was set off, which outpaced the realization of their decisions, leading them to constantly to try keeping pace with them. The paradox is even more profound, considering that US emerged as an ultra power or hyperpower, as the strongest country on an unprecedented scale in terms of its military, economic, and technological strength. The era of globalization, starting in significant measure with the end of the Cold War, had a distinctly US stamp. Yet, what we see today is a pushback against globalization phenomenon, even as it is driven by the lightning pace of technology, with the rise of the deglobalization phenomenon amongst the very countries and publics which still remain globalization's primary drivers. There's a broader discourse about the liberal global order having lost its self-validating appeal. The growing tension, Cold War Point 2, between US and Russia and between China and US is leading to light frontiers between the respective armed forces, even as the limited ground routes of the Cold War period have disappeared. The wide geographical swathes of instability and the expanding phenomenon of the failed or failing states, with the concomitant interlacing of mutating forms of jihadist terrorism, makes the prospect of a stable global order capable of addressing these challenges even more complex. The inadequacy of the traditional forms of power and fragmenting speaking identities impact negatively on societal and institutional cohesiveness, reinforcing a continuum from the domestic to the international of the elemental forces influencing the current global order. Resilience of institutions remains critical at national and multilateral level. Global megatrends, such as excessive domestic imbalances, like youth bulge, unregulated urbanization, forced internal and cross-border population displacement, disruptive technologies accelerating competition between countries, and empowering individual versus the state, the hybrid gray zone type of warfare, climate change, expanding reach of jihadist terrorism, unregulated strategic weapons ways, and newer forms of newer technology, weapon technology, etc., are amongst the global challenges which have an interconnecting and mutually reinforcing aspect. Increasing this functionality of global institutions becomes a challenge multiplier too, as do wild swan events. As India's international role expands, so do its challenges in foreign security areas, compounded further by its inhabiting a difficult neighborhood. The US National Intelligence Council, in its 2012 projections of global trends up to 2030, sums up the sheer methodological complexity of analyzing global trends with any degree of confidence. Analysis of outcomes, and these include analysis of outcomes of US role in the international system in a situation of its decline or a decisive reassertion in terms of the response of other powers. The other complexity is the complexity of dynamics of governance and exploration of complicated relationships among a diverse set of actors, especially the role of states versus non-state actors. A tendency to underestimate the rate of change with respect to the trajectory of rise and decline of states. The complexity of the framework between trends, discontinuities, and crises, and inadequate focus on smaller political psychosocial shifts defying ideological categorization, but driving behavior rather than grand ideology like fascism or communism. And lastly, difficulties in identifying looming disequilibria. Thus, one can see such a radical change circumstances in 1991. The exploration, therefore, is about as to whether it was inevitable.
Okay, so how does your book explain this situation of crisis as you have just described?
Right. So the early decisions, especially by the US, but also other Western European powers, resulted in a loss of control over the course of events for the US, even when it was the global hegemon. The course of these fateful events and the entirely unanticipated dialectics between these events and the constant readjustments by others to manage their ramifications is traced to understand the unfolding events. This loss of control resulted in regional instability, splitting of nations and state collapse, bloody conflicts within and between nation states, and splitting of national identities, precipitate weakening of multilateral organizations, and failure of the attempted alternatives, and increasing frequency of global economic and financial disruption. The delineation of this trajectory also provides insight about leaders making decisions on war and peace, drawing upon their convictions, their core beliefs in the righteousness of their monumental choices. The leaders find anchorage in the organizing principles of their polity, whose apex they occupy, and in the civilizational values of the communities organizing themselves in such a political formation. As reflections upon the life and the times, the observation of these trends does in some way touch upon the human condition, upon the pathology of conflict. The book surveys the intellectual foundation of the decisions of the Western leaders which shaped the political forces unleashed by the superpower détente. A chapter is on emergent geopolitical writings, serving as a validation for the decisions which had an air of triumphalism, of finality in their presuppositions about them. This survey includes a discussion on the post-Cold War international relations theories, which share with the geopolitical writings the characteristic of de-emphasis on state centrality in a new, clearly conceived post-Westphalian global order. This survey also covers the theories being developed by the other non-European emerging powers, especially China and India, which drew upon their own as well as the Western intellectual traditions to define their own external outlooks. The book further explores the post-Cold War Western measures to redesign the post-1945 global institutions according to their new thinking, which had crippling effect on their functioning. It covers the newer regional institutions or older transformed institutions, which also reflected changing geopolitical realities, but were unable to make the global multilateral institutional architecture effective in a meaningful manner to address global problems. Another chapter charts at length post-Cold War power transitions under the considerable impact of the policies of the Western powers, which unfolded along a completely unscripted trajectory, proving themselves to be unable to address the aspirations of the concerned publics and communities for an ennobling, uplifting empowerment. The lack of attention due to the Western intellectual predispositions on genuine internal democratization of the Soviet Communist Party and of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, despite their pan-national character, remains the primary flaw in the conception of these two crucial political transformations and the cause of subsequent turmoil and other undesirable consequences, but from which no lessons were drawn for successive power transitions. This survey of power transitions covers different regions of the globe for a broad picture about their outcome and for an understanding of the situation as it prevails now. The emergent geopolitics of the new global disorder is further described in its various characteristics, as well as the contemporary discourse as to what needs to be done about them, as a considerably large part of the problems can be linked to the phenomenon of state fragility or collapse, the state building efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the connected methodological perplexities are discussed. With growing instability and state collapse a reality, it is difficult to conceive of a multipolar or unipolar or any kind of global order, since these conceptions are premised on stable political systems having any institutional capacity or agency to function as part of any kind of order. The recent history of Afghanistan and Iraq illustrate this.
So, what is the relevance of the Gandhian praxis in terms of your analysis of this current global crisis, which you call the global disorder?
Right. A parallel thread is run throughout this exploration with the nature of the Gandhian praxis as evident in his steering the political transformation in India, leading to eventually to his independence in 1947. The objective is to engage with the same benchmarks of theoretical analysis of geopolitical trends, which have been so succinctly described, amongst others, by the erudite authors of the National Intelligence Council report, which I referred to earlier. And that is to ensure a stable dynamic in any political transformation, the internal power configuration of the political force driving that transformation is most critical. The chapter on the Gandhian praxis, as it relates to nation building and IR theory, explores these very benchmarks to show how the Gandhian political mobilization generated quite different results. The Gandhian praxis is explored through the drawing of contrasts with the current conundrums as to how an inclusive identity can be nurtured, social cohesion fostered, stability and resilience of political institutions ensured, and the quality of governance enriched. His doctrine of nonviolence, converting the adversary into a friend through personal suffering, or as Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore described it, Gandhi's gift of the fight, was also translated into a thoroughgoing internal democratization of the Congress Party through the empowerment of its grassroots members who are poor and the disadvantaged in overwhelming numbers. Honest and self-sacrificing nature of his leadership, scrupulously and publicly maintained party accounts, capacity for mass non-violent mobilization, and the elite identification with the poorest people. Through this instrumentality, he was able to launch a non-violent independence struggle at a time when this independence struggle was likely to take a violent course. Armed with constructive community development experience and his democratic culture, the party swiftly moved into its governance role, and despite the daunting domestic challenges in 1947, it quickly embarked on political consolidation of an infant state and invested the inherited political institutions with a remarkable resilience, which has stood the test of time through India's post-independence history. This is not just in contrast with the experience of other countries going through their own political transformations since the end of the Cold War, but also with India's sibling country, namely Pakistan, as well as other neighboring countries which have gone through their own rather bumpy political transformations. No less telling and relevant, despite its short-lived political legacy, is the highly successful non-violent mobilization of the Pushtun communities by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the frontier Gandhi, as we witness the mindless violence, great human tragedy, and the recurring bouts of state collapse in Afghanistan, embroiling the very same Pushtun community. He called forgiveness and righteousness as the weapon of the Prophet. Whilst his doctrinal articulation might seem to a lay reader a rather preposterous, or for that matter, his views on the contemporary developments, his application of his philosophy on the practical tasks of his day was seen by his contemporaries as highly practical and even astute. That is why his praxis has enduring and universal relevance. His philosophical complexity has led modern political scientists to analyze it from the point of view of realism or liberalism or postmodernism, but his is its own epistemology and ontology. Not very different from his other contemporary Indian political philosophers, he held that nationalism was an essential prerequisite of internationalism and that interstate relationships are based on domestic values and institutions where social harmony is basic to its nature. In considerable measure, the foreign policy of independent India was derived from his thinking, and Jawaharlal Nehru's innovative and bold, for his days, articulations on non-alignment and globalism were a rejection of bloc politics and contemporary IR theories developed both in the West as well as in the Soviet Union. The unique model of socio-economic development adopted by independent India in contrast with other decolonized countries and not quite conforming to the World Bank and the IMF orthodoxy of that time has been recognized by international economists as having influenced the thinking on development theory.
Right. So coming to today, how can this Gandhian praxis, what you said Tagore called the gift of the fight, how can it be applied to the current situation, particularly concerning India's strategic interests?
All right, so all these interwoven strands in the narrative suggest an alternate approach towards our common future, cognizant of the absence of any causative factors to turn things around even in the medium term, and that the discourse on the alternative futures presently is more of an aspirational nature. This narrative in the book draws lessons from the Gandhian praxis of steering political transformation, which is not divisive or destabilizing. The unanticipated, disruptive, and unstable post-Cold War political transitions even negatively impacted on the green shoots of political reform in China, where even today it's commonly held that the last thing China needs is a Gorbachev. Thus, the chapter on our options does a brief summary about the current parlous state of geopolitics and balance of power challenges, arms race, ineffectiveness of global institutions, climate change, conflict, and state fragility. As the discourse turns to the manner of creating world order 2.0, there is unease about managing an interconnected world's problems. The world leaders are more in a survival mode, accompanied by a defensive offensive impulse in the international arena. Although the technical solution to all the problems exist, it is the atmosphere of steady distrust amongst countries, especially the big powers, which is also resulting in a problem denial stance or grossly inadequate individual efforts. Domestically, the growing fault lines, splintering identities, and tenuous positions of leadership make these efforts at national and international levels inadequate. So the Gandhian praxis, which aims at internal stabilization of the political force wielding state power, has a far-reaching relevance today as we address the drivers of domestic and international fragility. One critical way of bringing stability to any political system is to encourage a healthy, grassroots empowering democracy within political parties, including regions or countries emerging from conflict situations. Internal party elections and rupture of politics' big money nexus through public auditing and funding caps will ensure both empowered grassroots cadres and more constructive program-oriented links between party workers and the local communities. This requires policy changes within countries and in large multilateral funding organizations such as the UN or the World Bank or the IMF, where their current policy approach is formalistic in the encouragement of democracy, devoid of any attention to the strength of internal party democracy in recipient countries. As Mahatma Gandhi indicates as regards the international impact of Indian independence, the initiation of such process in unstable regions, which comprise countries most in need of international assistance, would have multiple salutary effects on the geopolitical equilibrium and strengthen global opinion in its favor. Here, the collapse of the Soviet Union and of Yugoslavia can be taken as negative but validating examples. In fact, taking them as normative political benchmark, different countries can be judged in terms of their stability and institutional cohesiveness through reference to them, and alarm bells can be rung for corrective action domestically and externally as suggested. No less importantly, it also provides with high degree of specificity the orientation for mass movements across the world. The challenges for India in terms of its geographical location are no different from the rest of the world, as South Asia is a microcosm of these challenges. Be they geopolitical twists and turns, potentially destabilizing aspect of emerging weapons technology, conflict and state fragility, ineffectiveness of multilateral governance institutions, climate change, or woefully inadequate regional economic integration, the near to medium term outlook for the region is not more reassuring than the rest of the world. Afghanistan has been going through bouts of state collapse and violent regime change and is once again on a precipice. Pakistan remains a political system with an endemic jihadism suffusing it and pursuing a policy of state terrorism in that it plays a disruptive regional role. Other countries, be they Nepal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or the Maldives, have a zigzag, tortuous history of political transformation accompanied by considerable human suffering and adding the aspect of unpredictability in bilateral relations with India. Great power interests, especially of a rising and muscular China, have added an element of geopolitical uncertainty in South Asia as India focuses on creating a conducive external environment for the steady economic growth for its aspiring population. Its relations with the other big powers and regions, that is US, Russia, Western Europe, Gulf, Southeast Asia, Japan, etc., are geared towards advancing its foreign policy objectives, and these have been discussed in this book. As it must
Mr.
do
Kumar,
all it
I am
can.
sorry to say that I think we're running a little over time. So if you could wrap up in maybe in 1 minute. Thank you.
I'm just finishing off. As it must do all it can to calibrate its statecraft and build capacities, India's benign and non-disruptive international role can be further strengthened by the inclusion of the message of Mahatma Gandhi's Praxis to manage political change. This messaging can be incorporated in the program to UN, the World Bank, and other international entities. It can be included in India's own bilateral and multilateral soft power diplomacy. It remains the Gandhian bequest of faith in human capabilities and remains the right choice at these critical times. This is a book for people interested in geopolitics, IFA, and geopolitical theoretical writings, evolving international affairs and our current global challenges, and even generally how they are being addressed at the government and social levels. It is also a general reader of different age groups to look at the paradigm of change, especially political, and how it was driven and steered by Mahatma Gandhi and how it was so different from the ways we handled recent times. It is, as I said earlier, also about the human condition, the pathology of conflict. From the Gandhian techniques of political mobilization, practical actionable lessons can be drawn as we all move towards managing political change. And I dare say the lessons need to be drawn quickly because our challenges are gathering pace and becoming even more serious. And I want to thank once again the organizers and to my dear questioner for patience with my long explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm sure many people will benefit enormously by reading this book.
Well, I look forward to hearing more from them.